What's up, guys? I recently wrote an article called Optimizing Power for MMA that's on my website. But to review that article for some of you, if you didn't read it, I'm gonna go through some of the main points here and talk about why power is so important of a quality for MMA fighters and what are the best methods to develop power for MMA athletes. I've been working with MMA athletes for about the past 8 years, and power is one of the biggest traits that people look for when they come in and they're looking for performance training. When I ask, what are your main goals in performance training? Power is always one of the top ones. And it's pretty simple to correlate power with performance in MMA. If you look at a punch, a head kick, a takedown, all of those are explosive movements that have some element of power in order to perform these techniques at the best of your ability and to be successful, because power is a combination of force and speed. So if we're combining those things together, that's how we efficiently execute these techniques in the cage and make sure that they have enough effect when you actually hit your opponent. It's actually pretty well documented in the scientific literature as well that power and maximal power is a defining characteristic of more successful combat athletes. Some of the studies were looking at wrestlers and judo athletes, and the more elite athletes had better expressions of maximal power. And another study that looked at elite amateur boxers was looking at punching impact forces and comparing those to power tests like squat jumps and counter movement jumps, and they correlated a lot of the strength power qualities, and they concluded that those strength power qualities accounted for about 75% of the magnitude of punching impact forces. So it's pretty apparent how important power is to combat sport athletes, and most performance coaches accept that. However, where a lot of the debate lies is what are the best strategies for improving power for combat athletes. So depending on who you ask, what's the best method for improving power in MMA athletes, you're gonna get a lot of different answers. And it comes back to the old adage, when you give somebody a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you ask a lot of skill coaches, they're probably gonna tell you that the best way to improve power is to just throw more punches and kicks. And that's actually a great strategy because there's a lot of specificity to that. The specificity of the movement, punching and kicking, is exactly what we're gonna have to do in the sport. The problem is, there's no overload to those movements. The only way to overload those movements is just to throw more. So increasing total volume, as we know when it comes to developing power, is not going to lead to maximal power development. It may lead to some endurance adaptations, but it's not going to lead to, and it may lead to some efficiency. So there's definitely a place for that, and it's very important. But if there's no ability to overload, then we're not going to develop a further stimulus. Without stress, there's no adaptation. So we need to look at a lot of different strategies that we can use, and there's tons of scientific literature that backs up developing speed power and strength power qualities in the weight room through a whole bunch of different strategies leads to better expressions of power on the athletic field or in the cage. So if we look at a lot of those studies and we take the best methods for improving speed power qualities in athletes, and then we can extrapolate that and apply that to MMA athletes, we can come up with the best overall comprehensive strategy for improving power that translates into the cage. So it's important, if we're talking about power, we have to have a definition for what power is. Power is defined as the product of force times velocity. So if we think about power in that sense, then it's important to understand if we look at the force velocity curve, we're looking at high force, low velocity, and high velocity, low force, and everything throughout that entire spectrum, then we can understand where power lies on there, and we can see that there's two major components to improving power. So if you asked a strength type coach, they're gonna talk about improving strength to improve power, but that's only working on the force end of the spectrum. If you worked with a coach who primarily likes to do speed or plyometric training, then they're gonna say that's the best way to improve power. But again, now we're only working on the velocity end of the spectrum. We need to look at that entire force velocity spectrum, and we need to understand that we can improve qualities throughout that entire curve, and those combined together are going to lead to massive increases in power, and that's going to be the most efficient way to take our MMA athletes and develop that power that's going to translate into their sport. The first method to discuss is heavy strength training. Now we're talking about things that are operating at the high force, low velocity end of the spectrum. Many people will excuse this type of training because they say it's too slow, so it's not going to translate into speed or power. But that's been disproven in the literature extensively, especially when it comes to athletes with a lower training age. Heavy strength training develops inter and intramuscular coordination, maximal force outputs, muscle hypertrophy, rate of force development, and it can also really help with reducing the risk of injury. So there's a lot of benefits that can come from that. If you are an athlete with a low training age, so you've been training strength and conditioning for less than about 3 years, then you can actually see massive improvements in power just by strength training. So not only are you getting improvements in power, but you're getting a lot of improvements in all those other areas that we discussed. There is a law of diminishing returns when it comes to more elite and more advanced athletes. And when I say elite athletes, I'm talking about a high training age in the weight room. Just because you have a very elite level fighter does not mean they are at a very high training age, because they may not have been doing proper strength and conditioning for 3+ years. So they could still be a beginner when it comes to their training age. But when you're working with elite athletes, more strength isn't necessarily better once they've reached a certain point. But you can't take the strength training out, because we've also seen in the research that if you eliminate the strength training, not only do we lose some of that strength that we had, but you can also decrease power output. So we have to make sure that strength training is a part of any training program. So, and one last very important thing is that strength is the underlying characteristic that underpins all other athletic abilities. So it's a foundation that all athletic abilities are built on top of. So if you do not have a foundation of strength, you can only build that pyramid so high. Your foundation is so narrow that your pyramid can only go so high. So you need to stop focusing here and start focusing on building up that bigger base. So heavy strength training and strength training in general should be a part of any intelligent training program. And to excuse it as something that's irrelevant is ignorant and is misguided. The next method is Olympic weightlifting. Weightlifting exercises fall right in the middle of that force velocity spectrum. They're high force and high velocity, so they can be excellent exercises for developing power. And there's a lot of inter and intramuscular coordination that goes on with learning these patterns, and they've been very strongly correlated to athletic movements like jumping and sprinting and improving those outputs on the field. So for those reasons, a lot of people think that weightlifting is a phenomenal exercise for improving power in combat sports. And I would agree with all of those things. There's a lot of merit to that thought process. But the one other thing you need to think about is Olympic weightlifting is a sport in itself. So these movements are very complex, and they take a good amount of training to be able to appropriately and effectively execute these techniques to a point where we're not going to get injured, and we're going to actually get the adaptations we're looking for. When you're working with a combat sport athlete who is already learning 4 or 5 different sports, so when they go to practice, they have skill inputs of 4 to 5 different sports from all these different coaches, sometimes it's not the best idea to throw another brand new skill on top of that they have to learn. If they already know the techniques, or they already have a high level of skill and you can implement them quickly, or you're really good at teaching them very quickly, so you're not gonna take a ton of time to teach them to these athletes, then I think Olympic weightlifting moves are great. However, if you are not that efficient at teaching them, or your athletes are not learning them quickly, or they have too much stuff that they're trying to learn, then it may not be the best strategy, because your job as a performance coach is to find the easiest and simplest and most effective way to get to the goal, not necessarily just the most effective. So if you can still achieve that same goal in an easier or safer way, or quicker, then you need to choose that option most of the time. So Olympic weightlifting exercises are great, but we need to understand how they fall into the program, and we need to be able to compare them and work with certain athletes and be able to change that strategy, because they're not the only way to improve power. Ballistic training is another great method for improving power. Ballistic training is referring to when you're throwing, you're actually releasing an object. So there's no eccentric or deceleration forces coming back. So the great part about ballistic exercises like certain jumps or throws is that the athlete doesn't have to decelerate, so they can fully accelerate through the full range of motion. So instead of throwing a medicine ball and then because I have to bring that bar or whatever it is back, I have to slow down near this top end lockout range of motion. When I'm throwing the ball, I can fully accelerate and throw full force through the whole thing. So ballistic exercises are great and they should be a part of any training program for combat athletes. However, if you look at some of the research, ballistic exercises alone were actually shown to be less effective in improving power than a combination of ballistic exercises and heavy strength training. So that's why it's important to understand the full complex and not just say, ballistic exercises are great for improving power, so this is the method I'm going to use. Because there are other methods and they work best when combined. Plyometrics differ from ballistic exercises in that plyometrics involve a rapid stretch and shortening of the muscle. So there's usually that eccentric component. So this is when we usually have consecutive jumps or throws where there's a rebound. These are also phenomenal for rate of force development and for improving power because that rapid stretch shortening of the muscle is where we can that's where we improve that elasticity and we can use that elasticity in the cage. So this is a great way to improve power, improve rate of force development, improve speed. However, there's also a very high demand on the body with plyometric exercises. So if you look at the research on how much force is coming down on certain jumps, it's anywhere from 1.5 to 10 times body weight that can be coming down on a single leg or on double leg during these landings. So if you take an athlete who has poor levels of strength and you put them into a high level plyometric program, so you have an athlete who can barely squat their own body weight or barely stabilize their own body weight on one leg, and now you're going to ask them to jump and land on one leg where we've got, let's say, 5 times body weight coming down in that single leg, and they can't even stabilize 1 times body weight. It's a recipe for disaster. And then we add a ton of volume and speed on top of that. We're putting the risk, the cost benefit of these exercises, that ratio is changing quickly if they don't have the right strength foundations. So plyometrics are phenomenal and should be used in any intelligent programming for combat athletes. But again, they need to be used in a mixed strategy where we're also incorporating the proper strength training, building the right foundations, and incorporating some ballistic training and possibly weightlifting. Using contrast or complex training is using a phenomenon called post-activation potentiation. And post-activation potentiation is basically when we use a heavy loaded movement to stimulate my body to recruit a ton of motor units, muscle fibers, and to get everything firing in one specific pattern because it knows I need to give a maximum effort in that pattern. Once I do that, then I do a similar pattern in some sort of jump or plyometric type exercise where I'm going to be able to take advantage of all of that potentiation that I did, all of those motor units and muscle fibers that were recruited for that first exercise are now available for this unloaded exercise where they're not necessarily needed. So basically what that's going to do is give me a supranormal ability for that short window. So to give an example, let's say I had an athlete who could jump 30 inches as a vertical jump. Then I had them do a 1 RM back squat. So they back squatted their 1 RM. When they step out of that, give them a little bit of rest, maybe now they can jump 32 inches because they've potentiated their nervous system and their body to give them that extra ability. If we continue to use that and they train at this 32 inches, we've created this new trainable window. The more they train at that ability to jump 32 inches, their body is going to start to adapt and give them the ability to jump 32 inches. So eventually this is going to become their new power output. So you can see how we're increasing power output, and these can be used in a variety of exercises. So this can be used in general output stuff, just like that squat and squat jump, or it can be used in more specific patterns. Let's say a heavy loaded reverse lunge into some heavy bag knees. So now you're pairing a heavy loaded weight room movement with an unloaded explosive sport specific movement. So we're potentiating that sport specific movement to be faster. A couple really important things when it comes to post-activation potentiation is rest periods are crucial, because if we're not giving enough rest after the potentiating exercise, the fatigue that is induced from that exercise is actually going to limit the power effect of the next one. So when it comes to research, anywhere from 2 to 12 minutes have been the windows that they've shown to be most effective. But in practical experience, we don't have 12 minutes to rest in between these exercises. So I typically will give somewhere between 30 to 60 seconds of rest, up to 90 seconds, depending on how intense the potentiating exercise is. But the reality is I just don't have 5 minutes in between exercises to allow my athletes to rest and recover. So I need to take advantage of the best potentiation that I can get based on the abilities that I have in the gym. Another really important thing is the potentiating exercise needs to be similar, if not exactly the same, in patterns, so that we're getting the same joint and muscle sequencing, the same muscle recruitment, similar movement patterns, similar planes of motion. The more similar they are, the better the potentiation effect. So that reverse lunge in the knees, we're pretty close. That's gonna be a much better potentiating effect than a reverse lunge and a punch. So the more similar those patterns are, the better potentiating effect we're gonna have. And then I like to use unloaded or even overspeed assisted movements after the potentiating movement, so that we can get the best effect. And the last thing is the movements all have to happen as fast as possible. Even during the potentiation movement, you need to cue the athlete to have the intent of moving the bar or moving the weight, moving whatever as fast as possible. That's going to drive better power adaptations. And then in the jumps, the goal has to be jump as hard or as fast or as high as possible, so that we're getting the most out of those potentiating effects. So those are some of the best methods for improving power in MMA. However, each method on its own has been shown inferior in the research to the combined methods. So a mixed methods approach has been shown to be much more efficient. So using all of those methods I discussed, properly implementing all of them into a strength training program is the best way to improve power for MMA athletes. If we can take this along with our practical experience, and it's important to understand that the goals of the athlete, the training age of the athlete, there's a lot of other variables that we need to include instead of just plugging everyone into a certain program. But if we understand the goals of each athlete and we can assess each athlete and their specific goals and needs, and then use a mixed methods approach in order to improve the necessary qualities that they're lacking for power development, we can more efficiently improve power for MMA athletes. And we can also start to use the scientific literature combined with all the practical experience of domain experts and performance coaches that have been doing this for decades. If we can combine those together, then we can start to take an evidence-based approach at improving combat athletes, and we can take training for combat sports out of the archaic ages that it's in now and start working on a more professional approach to engineering combat athletes. If you want to dive deeper into this topic and you want to learn more about optimizing power for MMA, make sure you come check out our seminar, Engineering Combat Athletes, where I'm going to be joining with two of the best performance coaches and nutrition specialists in the world for combat athletes. And we're going to be bringing you a ton of information, and I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite methods for each of these different approaches to improving speed and power for combat athletes, and how to put them into a comprehensive and periodized training program. So stay tuned to my website, coachpjnestor.com, for more information like this, and make sure you check out that Engineering Combat Sport Athletes seminar coming up soon in Southern California.